I was 5.5 the first time I learned that the words inside my head were not the same as the words I was allowed to let out. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was bread day, and the whole kitchen smelled like yeast and wood smoke. We were gathered around the long pine table for the evening meal, my father at the head, my mother near the stove, my 4 brothers and 3 sisters all pressed shoulder to shoulder along the benches like sparrows on a fence rail. Something had been bothering me all afternoon, some little curiosity bubbling up the way curiosities do in small children, and I leaned forward and started to speak. My mother's fingers closed around my forearm before the second word left my mouth. She did not squeeze. She did not scold. She simply held me there and turned her face toward mine with a look I would come to recognize for the rest of my childhood. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something heavier. It was a look that said the floor I was standing on was thinner than I knew, and one wrong step could send all of us through it. I was 5 years old, and in that single second, without anyone explaining a thing to me, I understood that being a girl in our house meant carrying my voice the way you carry a lantern through a barn full of dry hay. Carefully. Quietly. With awareness that the wrong flicker could burn everything down. My name is Martha. I was raised old order Amish in a quiet stretch of farmland in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I walked away in my 20s, and this little corner of the internet is where I let myself say the sentences my community spent 2 decades training me to swallow. If you want the deeper layers, the things I cannot fit into one sitting, the full Amish Insider Guide is waiting for you in the description. And if a part of you wants to keep listening to a woman who finally took her prayer cap off and started telling the truth, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and meet me in the comments. Tell me, were you raised somewhere that taught you to take up less room than your body actually needed? I read every reply. Every single one. Now let me walk you through what Amish girls are taught long before they have the language to recognize a lesson is being given to them. The first lesson is never announced. It does not arrive in a sermon or a stern talking to. It is poured into a girl drop by drop, through the ordinary scenes of her ordinary days, before she has turned 5 summers old. She learns it from the way her mother is always moving and her father is always seated. She learns it from the way the men reach for their plates first, and the women refill the serving bowls before their own food has gone cold. She learns it from the way her older sisters slide off the bench mid-bite to clear away her father's dish the moment he leans back, satisfied. No one ever sat me down and explained any of it. They did not have to. A child watching is a child learning, and what I watched every morning and every evening was a household with an order as fixed as the seasons. The men moved through the world. The women moved around the men. Girls learned the choreography long before they learned to question who wrote it. By 4, I was matching socks beside my mother's rocking chair. By 5, I was setting 8 places at the table before sunrise. By 6, my hands were in the dishwater while my brothers thundered out the screen door to chase the dog through the orchard. I did not feel cheated. I did not even feel tired. I had nothing to compare it to. You cannot grieve a freedom you have never been shown. That is the quiet genius of how it works. It is not built on punishment. It is built on absence. You cannot reach for a door you have never been told exists. The second lesson finds you around 6 or 7, when the Ordnung begins to take a clearer shape inside your small mind. The Ordnung is our unwritten rule book, the living code that decides everything from the color of your dress to the angle of your buggy lamp. No one hands it to you in print. You learn it the way a fish learns the current, by being corrected every time you drift the wrong way. And for daughters, the current runs narrower and faster than it does for sons. My brother Samuel was older than me by 2 years. Samuel could vault the fence and run all the way to the Yoder farm without asking a soul. Samuel could lift his hand in church and ask the deacon to clarify a verse. Samuel could speak up at the supper table whenever a thought arrived in his head. Nobody had ever told him these things were permitted. They simply were, the way sunrise is permitted, the way breathing is permitted. For me and my sisters, the air was different. We asked before we crossed the gate. We did not raise our voices in worship. At meals, we waited. If a thought pressed against the back of our teeth, we learned to glance at our mother first, and read the small weather of her face. Was it safe to speak? Was the moment soft enough? We became fluent in that silent reading before we could read English script. We were taught, without anyone using the words, to occupy as little room in a room as a body could occupy. And when we did step over those invisible lines, when our voices climbed too high, when our questions cut too close, when our spirit showed what the elders called Eigensinn, our own willfulness, the correction arrived as surely as rain follows thunder. Sometimes it was nothing more than a glance across the table. Sometimes it was my mother's hand smoothing my hair that night with a sentence wrapped inside the gentleness. Sometimes it was the bishop's wife after service, her fingertips resting on my sleeve, her voice soft as butter, murmuring that a girl who fills herself up too full forgets who she is. A girl who fills herself up too full forgets who she is. I cannot tell you how many shapes that sentence took in my growing up. It came in dozens of voices. It always meant the same thing. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. Everything I am laying out here, the unwritten rules, the slow training, the music of correction, it is all part of something much wider than a single video can hold. And the guide steps inside all of it. The third lesson is the one that sinks the deepest, because it does not arrive wearing the face of restriction. It arrives wearing the face of love. By the time an Amish girl is 7 or 8, she begins receiving what I can only describe now, looking back as an adult, as a careful theological education in becoming small. It comes from the preachers. It comes from the bishop. It comes from the verses chosen and the verses skipped, and the way certain passages are pressed into your chest like a hand testing for a heartbeat. Gelassenheit. That is the word at the marrow of everything Amish. It is German and it means surrender, yielding, the soft laying down of your own will. In our community, Gelassenheit was the highest thing a soul could reach. The whole point of a life well lived was to hand over your own wanting to God, and to the community's reading of what God wanted, and to do so without flinching. For the men and the boys, Gelassenheit wore a certain shape. It meant not bragging about the harvest. It meant not buying a flashier buggy than your neighbor. It meant keeping yourself plain, your pride trimmed back like hedges in early spring. For the women and the girls, the shape was something else entirely. It meant your husband's word above your own. It meant the bishop's reading of scripture above whatever your own quiet study had shown you. It meant that the woman who bent was nearer to heaven than the woman who stood. I was 8 years old the autumn a woman in our district walked out of her marriage. I will not lay out her reasons here because they were real and they were heavy and they belonged to her. What I remember is the Sunday after she left, sitting on the long, backless bench, my legs not quite reaching the floor, listening to the bishop speak. He never used her name. He did not need to. Every soul in that room knew. And he said, in a voice as even as poured milk, that a woman who refuses to bend has lifted herself above her maker. I was 8. I sat on that hard plank and felt something settle into my chest that I would spend the next 20 years trying to lift back out. The lesson buried itself below thought, below words, below anything I could later argue with. For a woman, having a will of your own was not just a social misstep. It was a soul-level danger. It was a stain that followed you past the grave. Tell me what kind of weight that is to slip into the rib cage of a small child. Years later, after I had walked out of all of it, I met a woman named Rebecca at a coffee shop in a city neither of us had imagined we would ever stand inside. She had been raised in an even stricter district up in Ohio. We started talking the way ex-Amish women talk. Slowly at first, then in a flood. She told me her community had a phrase the girls were taught almost like a catechism. She called it the line. God, then the church, then the husband, then the children. A woman was a single link inside the line, and her holy work was to keep the chain from rattling. Rebecca told me that by the time she was 9, she had already learned never to contradict her older brother in front of guests, even when she knew with certainty that he was wrong. Nobody had to instruct her. She had watched her mother's face often enough. That face, the way the jaw tightened, the way the eyes flickered toward the door, the way the breath went shallow, was a whole language. It said, "You are making this heavier for all of us. Step back, soften, vanish into the line." Rebecca told me, With tears on her chin she did not bother wiping, that she had spent the first 3 decades of her life believing in her bones that having a private opinion was a form of sin, not as poetry, not as exaggeration. 3 decades carrying the certainty that her own thoughts were a spiritual threat. And here is what I need you to hear, because this is the part that confuses everyone on the outside. From the inside, none of it felt like a cage. That is the strangest sentence to try to hand to someone who has never lived inside something like this. When the framework around you is everyone you love, when the people enforcing it kiss your forehead at night and sing to you when you are sick, when the rules are stitched into hymns and shared meals, and the smell of your grandmother's kitchen on a winter morning, it does not feel like a fence. It feels like the sky. It feels like the way things simply are. I loved my community. I want to say that and mean it. I loved the frolics where 40 neighbors would arrive at dawn and a barn would stand by dusk. I loved the way nobody ever grieved alone, the way casseroles appeared at your door before the funeral was even planned. I loved the 4-part harmony rising out of a room with no instruments, just voices and breath and centuries. I loved the way Grandmother Eli's kitchen smelled in November when the apples were on the stove. None of that was a trick. None of that was fake. But here is what years of distance and slow rebuilding have taught me. You can love a place that wounded you. You can be grateful for what it gave you and still be honest about what it took. Those two truths are not enemies. They can sit together in the same heart, at the same table, breathing the same breath. What it took from me, more than anything else, was the trust I should have been allowed to have in my own perception. By the time I was 10, I no longer believed my own discomfort. When something inside me said this is not right, my next thought was never about the thing. It was about me. What is wrong with me, that I am bothered by this? What is broken in me, that I feel this way? That little reversal, that quiet inward turning of blame, is the most effective tool of control I have ever encountered, and it was wired into me before I could write my own name in cursive. If you want to go deeper into how this whole system breathes, and how women find the seams in it and slip out, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. There are stories and structures I cannot fit into one telling. There was a teacher in our one-room schoolhouse. Her name was Sister Lydia, and she was the first grown woman I ever watched stand inside her own body without apologizing for being there. She was not loud. She was not bold. She wore her cape dress and her white cap like everyone else. She prayed the same prayers. She bowed her head the same way. But when she taught, she would lean toward you just slightly, and her eyes would lock onto yours, and she would ask the most dangerous question I had ever been asked in my short life. She would ask, "What do you think?" Not what does the lesson say, not what should we say. What do you think? The first time she asked me that, I was 7 years old. I looked around the schoolhouse certain I had misheard. The question made no sense, like being asked what flavor the wind was. Of course I had thoughts. I had whole rivers of them. But the notion that a grown woman was waiting, that she had stilled herself in order to receive whatever I might say, was so foreign that my mouth went dry. It was a crack in the wall, a thin line of light coming through. I think about Sister Lydia often. I do not know what became of her. I do not know if she ever walked away or if she found a quiet way to keep breathing inside the walls. But I know what she planted in me with that one small question, asked of a 7-year-old girl, took root in soil the community would spend the next 15 years trying to scorch. They never quite managed it. Something she gave me kept growing. When I was 9, I started watching my mother with different eyes. Not the eyes of a daughter who accepted everything, but the eyes of someone who had begun, without naming it yet, to notice. I noticed that she never finished a thought when my father was in the room. He was not a harsh man. He never silenced her. He did not have to. She had taught herself, across years and years, that the proper length of a woman's sentence was however much room a man was willing to make for it. I noticed that when she disagreed, and she did disagree, I could read it in the tiny tightening of her mouth, the way her shoulders pulled half an inch higher. She would carry that disagreement around with her, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And eventually, alone with him at night, with the lantern low, she would offer it sideways. Never as a stance, always as a question. Wondering aloud, do you suppose, maybe, perhaps it might be worth thinking about? And then, buried under all that softening, the thing she actually believed. wrapped in so much padding that it could not be accused of being a challenge. She had learned to deliver her own mind like a guest knocking at the back door, hat in hand, hoping to be let in. I was 9. I watched her do this, and something inside me that was still mine, still untouched, said no. Said I do not want to spend the rest of my days knocking on the back door of my own house. That was the beginning, though I did not have the word for it then. That was the first thread coming loose. I was 9, and already I could feel the outline of the cage even while I still believed it was the shape of the whole world. My therapist, the one I finally found years after I walked away, said something to me on a gray Tuesday afternoon that I have carried in my pocket ever since. She said, "The deepest control is not when somebody tells you what to do. It is when they teach you to do it to yourself." By the time most Amish girls reach 10, they have become their own watchful eyes. They have learned to hush the small voice that whispers, "This is unfair." They have learned to translate their own ache into evidence of spiritual weakness. They have learned that the sweetest praise the world will offer them is, "She is such a good, quiet girl." And they have learned to hunger for that praise. Because inside a closed world, that praise is the bread of belonging. And belonging, when it is the only world you have ever been allowed to know, is the whole loaf. It is the whole table. It is the whole life. That is not weakness. I want to say it plainly. The girls who mastered the disappearing act, who folded themselves smaller and smaller until they could slip between the cracks unnoticed, they were not fragile. They were brilliant. They were doing exactly what any clear-eyed soul does when love and belonging sit on one side of the scale and shunning and exile sit on the other. They were making the only sane choice the system offered them. The cruelty was never in the girls. The cruelty was in the size of the choice. If you were raised somewhere that taught you your needs were greedy, that your voice took up too much air, that your job was to make yourself simple to carry, I see you. If you spent years convinced that your own ache was a defect in your spirit, a sin to repent of, a pride to mortify, you are not the only one. What was poured into you before you could refuse the cup was not the truth of the universe. It was a structure. Structures can be looked at. Structures can be named. And the moment you can see the shape of the bars clearly, the moment you can point to each one and say there, and there, and there, is where they taught me to make myself smaller. You have already begun to step through. I was not too young to fold laundry and wash plates and yield and vanish. I was too young to be told there had ever been another path. If anything in this opened a door inside you, leave me a note in the comments. Tell me which sentence stayed under your skin. Tell me if any of this brushed up against your own childhood, even if your childhood was nowhere near Lancaster County. Because the tools that were used on us, the silence, the belonging, the holy smallness, the way they taught us to turn our own pain into our own fault, those tools are not only Amish. They are older than any one community, and a great many people are still living inside them, still folding themselves smaller, still knocking quietly on the back door of their own lives. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. And if you want to keep hearing from a woman who finally let her own voice out from under the cap, subscribe to the channel. There are so many more truths I am still unpacking. Until I see you again, please hear me. Your thoughts were never a sin. They never were. Choose your freedoms carefully. They just might be the thing that saves you.